Chapter 14 of Against the Grain. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Against the Grain by Joris-Karl Huysmans. Translated by John Howard. Chapter 14, Part 1. Several days slowly passed, thanks to certain measures which succeeded in tricking the stomach. But one morning Des Esseintes could endure food no longer, and he asked himself anxiously whether his already serious weakness would not grow worse and force him to take to bed. A sudden gleam of light relieved his distress. He remembered that one of his friends, quite ill at one time, had made use of a Papin's digester to overcome his anemia and preserve what little strength he had. He dispatched his servant to Paris for this precious utensil, and following the directions contained in the prospectus which the manufacturer had enclosed, he himself instructed the cook how to cut the roast beef into bits, put it into the pewter pot, with a slice of leek and carrot, and screw on the cover to let it boil for 4 hours. At the end of this time, the meat fibres were strained. He drank a spoonful of the thick, salty juice deposited at the bottom of the pot. Then he felt a warmth, like a smooth caress, descend upon him. This nourishment relieved his pain and nausea, and even strengthened his stomach, which did not refuse to accept these few drops of soup. Thanks to this digester, his neurosis was arrested, and Des Esseintes said to himself, "Well, it is so much gained. Perhaps the temperature will change, the sky will throw some ashes upon this abominable sun which exhausts me, and I shall hold out without accident till the first fogs and frosts of winter." In the torpor and listless ennui in which he was sunk, the disorder of his library, whose arrangement had never been completed, irritated him. Helpless in his armchair, he had constantly in sight the books set awry on the shelves, propped up against each other, or lying flat on their sides like a tumbled pack of cards. This disorder offended him the more when he contrasted it with the perfect order of his religious works, carefully placed on parade along the walls. He tried to clear up the confusion, but after 10 minutes of work, perspiration covered him. The effort weakened him. He stretched himself on a couch and rang for his servant. Following his directions, the old man continued the task, bringing each book in turn to Des Esseintes, who examined it and directed where it was to be placed. This task did not last long, for Des Esseintes' library contained but a very limited number of contemporary secular works. They were drawn through his brain as bands of metal are drawn through a steel plate from which they issue thin, light, and reduced to almost imperceptible wires, and he had ended by possessing only those books which could submit to such treatment, and which were so solidly tempered as to withstand the rolling mill of each new reading. In his desire to refine, he had restrained and almost sterilized his enjoyment, ever accentuating the irremediable conflict existing between his ideas and those of the world in which he had happened to be born. He had now reached such a pass that he could no longer discover any writings to content his secret longings, and his admiration even weaned itself from those volumes which had certainly contributed to sharpen his mind, making it so suspicious and subtle. In art, his ideas had sprung from a simple point of view. For him, schools did not exist, and only the temperament of the writer mattered. Only the working of his brain interested him, regardless of the subject. Unfortunately, this verity of appreciation, worthy of Palisse, was scarcely applicable, for the simple reason that, even while desiring to be free of prejudices and passion, each person naturally goes to the works which most intimately correspond with his own temperament, and ends by relegating all others to the rear. This work of selection had slowly acted within him. Not long ago he had adored the great Balzac, but as his body weakened and his nerves became troublesome, his tastes modified and his admirations changed. Very soon, and despite the fact that he was aware of his injustice to the amazing author of the Comédie Humaine, Des Esseintes had reached a point where he no longer opened Balzac's books. Their healthy spirit jarred on him. Other aspirations now stirred in him, somehow becoming undefinable. Yet when he probed himself, he understood that to attract, a work must have that character of strangeness demanded by Edgar Allan Poe. But he ventured even further on this path and called for Byzantine flora of brain and complicated deliquescences of language. He desired a troubled indecision on which he might brood until he could shape it at will to a more vague or determinate form according to the momentary state of his soul. In short, he desired a work of art both for what it was in itself and for what it permitted him to endow it. He wished to pass by means of it into a sphere of sublimated sensation which would arouse in him new commotions whose cause he might long and vainly seek to analyze. In short, since leaving Paris, Des Esseintes was removing himself further and further from reality, especially from the contemporary world, which he held in an ever-growing detestation. This hatred had inevitably reacted on his literary and artistic tastes, and he would have as little as possible to do with paintings and books whose limited subjects dealt with modern life. Thus, losing the faculty of admiring beauty indiscriminately under whatever form it was presented, he preferred Flaubert's Tentation de Saint Antoine to his Éducation sentimentale, Goncourt's Faustin to his Germinie la Certeux, Zola's Faute de l'Abbé Mouret to his Assommoir. This point of view seemed logical to him. These works, less immediate but just as vibrant and human, enabled him to penetrate farther into the depths of the temperaments of these masters, who revealed in them the most mysterious transports of their being with a more sincere abandon, and they lifted him far above this trivial life which wearied him so. In them he entered into a perfect communion of ideas with their authors, who had written them when their state of soul was analogous to his own. In fact, when the period in which a man of talent is obliged to live is dull and stupid, the artist, though unconsciously, is haunted by a nostalgia of some past century. Finding himself unable to harmonize, save at rare intervals, with the environment in which he lives, and not discovering sufficient distraction in the pleasures of observation and analysis, in the examination of the environment and its people, he feels in himself the dawning of strange ideas. Confused desires for other lands awake and are clarified by reflection and study. Instincts, sensations, and thoughts bequeathed by heredity awake, grow fixed, assert themselves with an imperious assurance. He recalls memories of beings and things he has never really known, and a time comes when he escapes from the penitentiary of his age and roves in full liberty into another epoch with which, through a last illusion, he seems more in harmony. With some, it is a return to vanished ages, to extinct civilizations, to dead epochs. With others, it is an urge towards a fantastic future, to a more or less intense vision of a period about to dawn, whose image, by an effect of atavism of which he is unaware, is a reproduction of some past age. In Flaubert, this nostalgia is expressed in solemn and majestic pictures of magnificent splendors, in whose gorgeous, barbaric frames move palpitating and delicate creatures, mysterious and haughty, women gifted in the perfection of their beauty with souls capable of suffering, and in whose depths he discerned frightful derangements, mad aspirations, grieved as they were by the haunting premonition of the disillusionments their follies held in store. The temperament of this great artist is fully revealed in the incomparable pages of the Tentation de Saint Antoine and Salammbô, where, far from our sorry life, he evokes the splendors of old Asia, the age of fervent prayer and mystic depression, of languorous passions and excesses induced by the unbearable ennui resulting from opulence and prayer. In de Goncourt, it was the nostalgia of the preceding century, a return to the elegances of a society forever lost. The stupendous setting of seas beating against jetties, of deserts stretching under torrid skies to distant horizons, did not exist in his nostalgic work, which confined itself to a boudoir near an aulic park, scented with the voluptuous fragrance of a woman with a tired smile, a perverse little pout, and unresigned pensive eyes. The soul with which he animated his characters was not that breathed by Flaubert into his creatures, no longer the soul early thrown in revolt by the inexorable certainty that no new happiness is possible. It was a soul that had too late revolted, after the experience, against all the useless attempts to invent new spiritual liaisons, and to heighten the enjoyment of lovers, which from immemorial times has always ended in satiety. Although she lived in and partook of the life of our time, Faustin, by her ancestral influences, was a creature of the past century, whose cerebral lassitude and sensual excesses she possessed. This book of Edmond de Goncourt was one of the volumes which Des Esseintes loved best, and the suggestion of reverie which he demanded lived in this work, where under each written line another line was etched, visible to the spirit alone, indicated by a hint which revealed passion, by a reticence permitting one to divine subtle states of soul which no idiom could express. And it was no longer Flaubert's language in its inimitable magnificence, but a morbid, perspicacious style, nervous and twisted, keen to note the impalpable impression that strikes the senses, a style expert in modulating the complicated nuances of an epoch which in itself was singularly complex. In short, it was the epithet indispensable to decrepit civilizations, no matter how old they be, which must have words with new meanings and forms, innovations in phrases and words for their complex needs. At Rome, the dying paganism had modified its prosody and transmuted its language with Ausonius, with Claudian and Rutilius, whose attentive, scrupulous, sonorous and powerful style presented in its descriptive parts especially reflections, hints and nuances bearing an affinity with the style of de Goncourt. At Paris, a fact unique in literary history had been consummated. That moribund society of the 18th century, which possessed painters, musicians and architects imbued with its tastes and doctrines, had not been able to produce a writer who could truly depict its dying elegances, the quintessence of its joys so cruelly expiated. It had been necessary to await the arrival of de Goncourt, whose temperament was formed of memories and regrets made more poignant by the sad spectacle of the intellectual poverty and the pitiful aspirations of his own time, to resuscitate, not only in his historical works, but even more in Faustin, the very soul of that period, incarnating its nervous refinements in this actress who tortured her mind and her senses so as to savour to exhaustion the grievous revulsives of love and of art. With Zola, the nostalgia of the far away was different. In him was no longing for vanished ages, no aspiring towards worlds lost in the night of time. His strong and solid temperament, dazzled with the luxuriance of life, its sanguine forces and moral health, diverted him from the artificial graces and painted chloroses of the past century, as well as from the hierarchic solemnity, the brutal ferocity, and misty, effeminate dreams of the old Orient. When he too had become obsessed by this nostalgia, by this need, which is nothing less than poetry itself, of shunning the contemporary world he was studying, he had rushed into an ideal and fruitful country, had dreamed of fantastic passions of skies, of long raptures of earth, and of fecund rains of pollen falling into panting organs of flowers. He had ended in a gigantic pantheism, had created, unwittingly perhaps, with this Eden-esque environment in which he placed his Adam and Eve, a marvelous Hindu poem, singing, in a style whose broad, crude strokes had something of the bizarre brilliance of an Indian painting, the song of the flesh, of animated living matter, revealing to the human creature, by its passion for reproduction, the forbidden fruits of love, its suffocations, its instinctive caresses and natural attitudes. With Baudelaire, these three masters had most affected Des Esseintes in modern French secular literature. But he had read them so often, had saturated himself in them so completely, that in order to absorb them he had been compelled to lay them aside and let them remain unread on his shelves. Even now, when the servant was arranging them for him, he did not care to open them, and contented himself merely with indicating the place they were to occupy and seeing that they were properly classified and put away. The servant brought him a new series of books. these oppressed him more. They were books towards which his taste had gradually veered, books which diverted him by their very faults from the perfection of more vigorous writers. Here, too, Des Esseintes had reached the point where he sought, among these troubled pages, only phrases which discharged a sort of electricity that made him tremble. They transmitted their fluid through a medium which at first sight seemed refractory. Their imperfections pleased him, provided they were neither parasitic nor servile, and perhaps there was a grain of truth in his theory that the inferior and decadent writer, who is more subjective though unfinished, distills a more irritating aperient and acid balm than the artist of the same period who is truly great. In his opinion, it was in their turbulent sketches that one perceived the exaltations of the most excitable sensibilities, the caprices of the most morbid psychological states, the most extravagant depravities of language, charged, in spite of its rebelliousness, with the difficult task of containing the effervescent salts of sensations and ideas. Thus, after the masters, he betook himself to a few writers who attracted him all the more because of the disdain in which they were held by the public incapable of understanding them. One of them was Paul Verlaine, who had begun with a volume of verse, the Poèmes Saturniens, a rather ineffectual book where imitations of Leconte de Lisle jostled with exercises in romantic rhetoric, but through which already filtered the real personality of the poet in such poems as the sonnet Rêve familier. In searching for his antecedents, Des Esseintes discovered, under the hesitant strokes of the sketches, a talent already deeply affected by Baudelaire, whose influence had been accentuated later on, acquiesced in by the peerless master, but the imitation was never flagrant. And in some of his books, Bonne Chanson, Fête Galante, Romance sans parole, and in his last volume, Sagesse, were poems where he himself was revealed as an original and outstanding figure. With rhymes obtained from verb tenses, sometimes even from long adverbs preceded by a monosyllable from which they fell as from a rock into a heavy cascade of water, his verses, divided by improbable caesuras, often became strangely obscure with their audacious ellipses and strange inaccuracies which none the less did not lack grace. With his unrivaled ability to handle metre, he had sought to rejuvenate the fixed poetic forms. He turned the tail of the sonnet into the air, like those Japanese fish of polychrome clay which rest on stands, their heads straight down, their tails on top. Sometimes he corrupted it by using only masculine rhymes to which he seemed partial. He had often employed a bizarre form, a stanza of 3 lines whose middle verse was unrhymed, and a tercet with but 1 rhyme, followed by a single line, an echoing refrain like Dans son la gigue in Streets. He had employed other rhymes whose dim echoes are repeated in remote stanzas, like faint reverberations of a bell. But his personality expressed itself most of all in vague and delicious confidences, breathed in hushed accents in the twilight. He alone had been able to reveal the troubled ultima thules of the soul, low whisperings of thoughts, avowals so haltingly and murmuringly confessed that the ear which hears them remains hesitant, passing on to the soul languors quickened by the mystery of this suggestion, which is divined rather than felt. Everything characteristic of Verlaine was expressed in these adorable verses of the Fête Galante. Le soir tombait, un soir équivoque d'automne, les belles se pendant rêveuses à nos bras, dirent alors des mots si spécieux tout bas, que notre âme depuis ce temps tremble et s'étonne. It was no longer the immense horizon opened by the unforgettable portals of Baudelaire. It was a crevice in the moonlight, opening on a field which was more intimate and more restrained, peculiar to Verlaine, who had formulated his poetic system in those lines of which Des Esseintes was so fond. Car nous voulons la nuance encore, pas la couleur, rien que la nuance, et tout le reste est littérature. Des Esseintes had followed him with delight in his most diversified works. After his Romance sans paroles, which had appeared in a journal, Verlaine had preserved a long silence, reappearing later in those charming verses hauntingly suggestive of the gentle and cold accents of Villon, singing of the Virgin removed from our days of carnal thought and weary flesh. Des Esseintes often reread Sagesse, whose poems provoked him to secret reveries, a fanciful love for a Byzantine Madonna, who at a certain moment changed into a distracted modern Cydalise, so mysterious and troubling that one could not know whether she aspired towards depravities so monstrous that they had become irresistible, or whether she moved in an immaculate dream where the adoration of the soul floated around her ever unavowed and ever pure. There were other poets, too, who induced him to confide himself to them. Tristan Corbière, who in 1873, in the midst of the general apathy, had issued a most eccentric volume entitled Les Amours Jaunes. Des Esseintes, who, in his hatred of the banal and commonplace, would gladly have accepted the most affected folly and the most singular extravagance, spent many enjoyable hours with this work, where drollery mingled with a disordered energy, and where disconcerting lines blazed out of poems so absolutely obscure as the litanies of Sommeil, that they qualified their author for the name of obscène confesseur des dévotes morts-nés. The style was hardly French. The author wrote in the Negro dialect, was telegraphic in form, suppressed verbs, affected a teasing phraseology, revelled in the impossible puns of a travelling salesman. Then out of this jumble, laughable conceits and sly affectations emerged, and suddenly a cry of keen anguish rang out like the snapping string of a violoncello. And with all this, in his hard, rugged style, bristling with obsolescent words and unexpected neologisms, flashed perfect originalities, treasures of expression, and superbly nomadic lines amputated of rhyme. Finally, over and above his Poème parisien, where Des Esseintes had discovered this profound definition of woman, éternel féminin de l'éternelle jocrisse, Tristan Corbière had celebrated in a powerfully concise style the sea of Brittany, mermaids and the pardon of Sainte Anne, and he had even risen to an eloquence of hate in the insults he hurled apropos of the Conlie camp at the individuals whom he designated under the name of foreigners of the 4th of September. the raciness of which he was so fond, which Corbiere offered him in his sharp epithets, his beauties which ever remained a trifle suspect, Des Esseintes found again in another poet, Théodore Hannon, a disciple of Baudelaire and Gautier, moved by a very unusual sense of the exquisite and the artificial. Unlike Verlaine, whose work was directly influenced by Baudelaire, especially on the psychological side, in his insidious nuances of thought and skillful quintessence of sentiment, Théodore Hannon especially descended from the master on the plastic side, by the external vision of persons and things. His charming corruption fatally corresponded to the tendencies of Des Esseintes, who, on misty or rainy days, enclosed himself in the retreat fancied by the poet, and intoxicated his eyes with the rustlings of his fabrics, with the incandescence of his stones, with his exclusively material sumptuousness which ministered to cerebral reactions, and rose like a cantharides powder in a cloud of fragrant incense towards a Brussels idol with painted face and belly stained by the perfumes. With the exception of the works of these poets and of Stéphane Mallarmé, which his servant was told to place to one side so that he might classify them separately, Des Esseintes was but slightly attracted towards the poets. End of chapter 14, part 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.